All right, here we have this is going to be a very interesting podcast for me. Here we have my partner and brother Adam Edelstein joining me for the very first time. Usually, he refuses to join me, so this is a really good day for me. Adam and I both been practicing together for a long time, but Adam is been a matrimonial family law attorney for how many years now?
Since 92.
All right, so a long time, and of course, I practice primarily in the personal injury medical malpractice world. So we really do two different things, but both of them involve really the same thought process and same analysis. And over the years, I know you and I have had a number of discussions. Usually they're in the hallway or the bathroom, and a lot of debates about our cases and issues that are going on in the public realm and how we think of them as both lawyers and personally. So I thought it would be a good idea today, following the midterm elections of this week. And we're always talking about current events, particularly elections, election law, all of these things that we see going on at the time, to ask you your opinions. Now, but here's the thing. I want to have some ground rules here because I know you. You're my brother and my partner. We both have our own personal feelings about the elections and politics and really every issue. In fact, we always have personal feelings about cases when we talk to each other. But quite frankly, you usually have very negative feelings about a lot of my cases. And you voice them. And actually, that's helpful to me as a lawyer because it sort of makes me look at the other side of what a defense lawyer might say to me. So as lawyers, it's really helpful to have the opposing opinion. But I think you would agree with me, you and I as lawyers at times have to segregate our personal opinions about our case, our client, or the issue, or even the law, because our role is really as advocates. And a lot of times before we advocate, we have to actually explain to our client, hey, this is how we think it might go. This is what you're facing, and this is what we think might happen. You do that all the time?
Yes. So can I mention that you neglected in that long factual introduction to alert your viewers to the fact that I'm your older brother, smarter brother, and better looking brother. So what can I do for you now?
Well, there you go. So there's the opposing view that we don't always agree
We can
with.
talk about that. A very good life experience and theory on exactly what you just brought up. And I'll talk about that briefly as well.
Right. So let's do that. So let's start by that. So we were talking about the elections. And
let me get back. We'll talk about the election in a second. And I thought it would be best, again, because you're right, we're lawyers. And there's something I think lawyers learn in law school, which eventually they never have the chance to use. So when you're in law school, our complaints were, they never really taught you how to practice law in the street, litigation, filing papers, paying the filing fee. But what you were taught in law school in retrospect, which is really important and ultimately very useful to our day-to-day practice, but also useful as just a human, is you taught to think and analyze. There were no tricks. They taught you this. So what I thought would be a good topic was not only election law and what's really going on, but the first topic, which we talked about, that I learned my first year of law school. You had to take mandatory classes, and one of the classes was called the legal process. So now you think legal process, well, what does that mean? Like, I get to sue you in small claims court. So the process is I walk there and pay what? No, what it turned out was the legal process was a philosophy class in law school. And the main point was, here's how lawmaking and policy should be analyzed under this foundational principle of the United States, which is all about your freedom and your rights. So what this professor at law school, his name is Bailey Kuklin, by the way. It's a fabulous name. It was almost Hollywood. He taught us the concept of analyzing what is just, J-U-S-T, versus what is fair. And we're looking at him like, I'm paying all this money for law school for that. And here's the analysis, that everything in our country is about your rights, but we have to balance the right of the individual versus the right of the greater good, the electorate, the larger community. So the perfect examples of the conflicts that you see every day, that there are countries founded on the principle of leave me alone. I have individual rights, liberty, and all freedom of thought. But the country was also founded on the principle that there's a common good that we have to work towards, which may at times stomp on the individual's rights. So remember the social contract in fifth grade? You're making a contract with your government. You're giving up some of your individual rights for the sake of the greater good by allowing the government to govern. Okay. So again, then you brought up conflict resolution, I think, which is, well, who's right in any of these conflicts? So,
Right, but before you go to conflict resolution, let's stop you at the just argument versus the fair argument, because I run into that all the time. So, for example, last night, my kids, and I know you know my kids, there was some fighting going on, and there was some depriving of social media time on their phones. And the immediate response I got from my son when I turned off his phone was, it's not fair.
Well, forgive me for criticizing that example. That is I'll turn it into what I'm saying is there's social contract in your home. And that is similar to the social contract that citizens have with their government, that I'm giving up my individual right to drive 95 miles an hour for the rights of the greater good and regulating the speed so that people don't get killed. I know you may in your other.
Well, my house is a little bit.
Okay, so in your home, you have a contract. There are behaviors that have to be adhered to, and when there is something done inappropriately, the punishment in this giving up your right to say, I have social media 24/7 unconditionally. So that's the way I look at that, your process, and analogize it to the just and the fair. Remember, maybe your son has some wacky but theoretically fair, or not fair argument, but an argument that this should not be something that warrants taking away my right to play on the internet alone. Your position is no, we are setting an example for the whole family that in this situation, you have to behave as follows for the good of the family, for all of our goods. Your example was a little tricky.
Yeah, right. So, my example comes out of a dictatorship.
Guns.
So
we have a right to a gun. Gun. And
there you go.
But what about the greater goods? Safety rights and the conflict resolution becomes, should we regulate and take away that sacred individual right for the right of the greater good? What's fair versus what's just? No one's wrong in that analysis. And that's briefly what one of our topics was. And if you want to get into something, it's a little bit different. We were going to talk about election laws, but you're right. We bring a subjective view to things. And I want to tell people that constantly remind myself to speak, preach, analyze, and always remember the rose glasses that everyone has and brings to the table, and that's subjectivity. Why is that important? Because to resolve conflict in democracies and courtrooms, you do have to put yourself in the shoes of the other side. So you have to always remind folks, what you're going to hear from me, I'm trying to not color it, and I'm just trying to make people think, because that's what I've learned to love. Even in the practice of law, you always thought, when am I going to be able to go think about theoretical legal concepts? He's not paying child support, Judge, throw him in jail. Sometimes it's fun, but it really is there, the analysis in this legal process and this philosophy, because you and I know when we go into courtrooms, we think now like lawyers strategically and as advocates. It's fabulously interesting when what you learned becomes something you employ in your everyday life. So elections.
Let's talk about elections.
So this is what hit me in the last few days. Obviously, there's so many things we could talk about that it would be impossible to list them, let alone talk about them. So what impressed me in the last few weeks was what happened in Brazil. And the big dispute here is over election fraud and methodology. You need an ID, you should do this, do that, paper ballots, someone's stealing them, and the Russians this nonsense. So the Brazilians had a very significant election 2 weeks ago, and they have very similar issue to what we have, these polarized two different candidates, very high conflict. They prepared for the election by looking at what happened here, because they said, hey, that's a perfect example of our political climate. And we could have a riot after this election in Brazil, a war, because it's a lot more volatile there. So they were getting prepared beforehand to make sure the results would be vetted and fair, and that any potential blow-ups or violence would be addressed in advance. So what happened in Brazil? This is what you learn. That the Europeans and Brazil, their elections are paperless, which means it's all electronic. In some instances in Europe, you can vote off your phone. They trust their systems. Those results are given in their election same day. They're audited same day. Could there be an issue if it's all electronic? Of course there can. But these electors in Europe and in Brazil have accepted that methodology for years. And
wait a minute, so nobody in Europe is going and filling out a box like I just did yesterday?
No, and I did it too. And I mean, and this will get to another topic in a moment, and people may not want to hear it, but that's what impressed me the other day. And when I like the word juxtapose, it's a fabulous word. All it means is you look at their stuff and compare it with what we have. And this is the next topic where I try to not to be subjective. I just want people to think. And that is, in our present government and our economic system, where it's this freedom to engage in wealth making and advancing oneself, things like that, law-making process and policy process here, I think, is usually driven by reaction. I'll give you an example. 9/11, 9/11. You saw a flurry of laws come out within days, if not hours and weeks, designed to fight terrorism, right? What happened? It was reactive.
Sure, and to make it even more recent, with the pandemic hitting, New York City, one of the hardest places to get a law changed at all. Literally overnight, all the laws were changed. Sidewalk
By the way, I should have thought of that this morning when I was thinking of analogies. Pandemic, fabulous example. Now, this is what's happening. By the way, it's not unique to the United States government, but we'll get there in a moment. So lawmaking in general and policy, governmental policy and lawmaking is, I think in general, reactive to an immediate problem. Pandemic, change the laws. 9/11, no more shoes on planes. Now, that's a lawmaking process that could work. But there's another way to make policy to change law, and that's to be forward thinking and to think about, based on history, which repeats itself, on the horizon is going to be a problem that the government has to handle. Start to get on it early, plan. Then you don't react, you're ready, you're proactive. Great example of the pandemic. Best example of global warming. Even if you don't believe in it, imagine if the red flag of global warming was raised 100 years ago and progress was made. That would have required strategic thinking. But the pandemic is a fabulous example. So our process, and it happens in the lawmaking process as well, and it really is disturbing because, go back to the first topic, there's a greater good to look after, and that requires long-term planning politically and not reaction. Because when you react as a lawmaker or even as a lawyer, you're doing it with colored glasses because you're seeing the electorate is terrified of another terrorist attack. To secure the feelings of my citizens, I need to give them something immediately to make them feel safe, whether that would be full regulation on TSA and airlines within weeks of the incident or something else. Now,
so is that what you're saying is now a reactionary law process to election frauds? And
so let's talk about the U.S. election system and the lawmaking process, the same thing. So Brazil, Western Europe, United States. In Brazil, they have a uniform election law throughout the country. And Brazil has, 30 states. They have one law. Everyone has to do it the same. In the United States, we have election laws, much of which was made reactively because of the last election, without real thought and process. In the United States, we have hundreds of conflicting election laws from the state level to the sheriff at the local. So in this county, you have to stand on one leg on Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock and vote in person. And in that county, you can mail it in even if you're on Mars. Okay, the point is their systems work. They have never had anyone real mass voter fraud. And this is a result of planning. It doesn't happen overnight. We're reacting again. And generally in history, reactive lawmaking, reactive policy making in the near term generally statistically doesn't work. And as historians and lawyers, we know to learn from history. It repeats itself. There's patterns we can inevitably see. Oh, we're going to have on the horizon certain economic disadvantages if we don't address long-term issues like energy and or things like that. You don't have to have a position on these things. All I want people to do is think about it. That's all. And when you start thinking about it, even if two people disagree, the dialogue and the process should result in reasonable laws and policies balancing the rights of the individual and the greater good.
Right. So let's
The individual says, I'm convinced it's voting fraud. It all has to be in person and paper. That's someone's individual right to say elections should be run like this. But what about the greater good?
So let's bring it back home and let's sort of wrap up on this here. As a lawyer, so the way we practice is we don't oftentimes get in courtrooms and see reactionary rulings to things, even if we think the law is wrong.
But I use it all the time. I got a great example. Here's how I use what I learned. That's effective. When I'm arguing, hey, I'm a divorce lawyer. Can you imagine I get to use these theories? And here's what we do. I say to a judge as follows. Here's your fact pattern, judge, right now. I have this client and the adversary, her husband, is not doing certain things that you ordered him to do. I'll give the best example. He's not paying child support. Hasn't paid it in years, flaunting the fact that he can afford things and so forth. So what does the judge have? He has discretion when I come in and say, Judge, I want you to hold him in contempt for not paying court-ordered child support. Now, when I ask him to do that, he has the discretion, the judge, to look at the law and pick a punishment. Now, of course, I'm a lawyer. I want the guy thrown in jail. I went for her. How am I going to convince him to put in place the most severe punishment? Because one alternative could be, I'll give you a last chance. That doesn't work. I'll take your driver's license away, and maybe that'll make you pay. I'll throw you in jail weekends. What I argue is policy at the end. I say to the judge, here's why you have the discretion to take door number one, throw him in jail. It's the greater good that's at stake. You want to send a message to the litigants, to the world, that there actually is a policy theory behind getting thrown in jail in this situation, and it's to deter people from not paying child support in the future. I think that's a fair way to argue. It's not just about the individual rights of the mother to get her money, and that's a serious individual right, Judge, that you have to protect. That kid needs child support, but you're also sending a message to the greater good, the large one. If you don't pay, here's the judge's policy: 60 days in jail. I employ these things, and I have seen judges take a step back and understand, yeah, I get it. There is a modus operandi to judges' methodology to convince not only people in the individual case do the right thing, but thinking about how does this impact the bigger community that's fighting in court.
I get it. So you see, so basically, I get it. So where you're really going, because I'm going to wrap this up, is that, there's a balancing act in the law at the micro level, which is the courtrooms that you and I practice all the time, and the macro level, which is the legislative branch of the government. Right. And oftentimes, even at the micro level, there's a reactionary aspect to it, as opposed to a greater good. And that sometimes ends up in a bad result. And sometimes in the legislative area, there's a reactionary aspect to the law that
doesn't help. It might hurt.
Right. It results in quick changes that maybe aren't the best. And so there's a balancing act. And I think that's why. Let me just finish here. And we're going to wrap it up. And that's why I think it's really important to have advocates like you and like me be in there at both the micro, the court level, and macro, the legislative level. And oftentimes they'd be called lobbyists at that point. But to present to these people to say, here are both sides of the coin. And it really does trace back to what you learned in law school. And I had Professor Bailey Kuklin as well. He told me I wasn't as good a student as my brother. That was fantastic to hear on the first day. But in balancing, what is just for the individual versus what is fair in terms of a greater good, and the law really is a balancing act on both. So I think it's an awesome point. I appreciate you getting with me, and I'll call you up again when I have something more important. No, I think that's it. I think we're good. No, I don't want any more points from you.
I have an idea for
I
the
think I'm done.
podcast. Quickly, if you invite me back.
Well, I
I'm
will invite you back.
almost done and getting my ventriloquism degree. I was thinking maybe we could do a ventriloquist one. I'm gonna have
Maybe. See
maybe
you next time.
dating game format.
See you next time.
Don't forget to tip your waiters and waiters. Good night, everyone.
See you.